Hey, thanks for checking out my video. Chris here from Meditations on the Tarot. In this video, I wanted to talk about some of the similarities of the history of Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism. This video will be part 4 of a series entitled Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism. In the first video, we talked about some of these connections from a Masonic point of view, and I read aloud from Freemasonry, A History by Angel Millar. And that's from a Masonic point of view. In the second video, I read aloud from Rosicrucian History and Mysteries by Christian Rabiz. And this book is written from a Rosicrucian perspective. In the third video, I talked about some of the connections between Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism from a Gnostic perspective, and I read from Tobias Churton's The Gnostics. So this fourth video, I wanted to present some of this history, some of these connections between Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism from a scholarly perspective, from a scholar's point of view. And it was tough to decide which book to use, which book that I wanted to share with you. This book is fantastic. It's called The Invisible History of the Rosicrucians, the World's Most Mysterious Secret Society. And this is written by Tobias Churton. And there's certainly a wealth of material here, and I think eventually I will share this as part of my series. Tobias Churton is a lecturer about Freemasonry, but he's also a Mason, and in that respect, I think that some of the views that Tobias Churton puts forward are very closely mirror the Masonic perspective, and in that way I don't think it's a truly scholarly perspective. Another great book that goes into this is The Rosicrucians, The History, Mythology, and Rituals of an Esoteric Order by Christopher McIntosh. And again, this is really great stuff, but this really leans a lot more towards the Golden Rosenkreuz fraternity, and I'll probably share this at a later date. But from a scholarly perspective, I think that the best book that I could share with you would be Dame Frances Yates' The Rosicrucian Enlightenment. And Tobias Churton talks about Dame Frances Yates in her book, the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, and he talks about she made some mistakes, maybe some thinking errors in her book, and I would agree with some of that. Also, this book was published in 1982, whereas Tobias Churton's book was published in, I think, 2017 or 2018, so there was a lot more material available to him at that time. In the back of the book, this says, Dame Frances Yates, 1899 to 1981, reader in the history of the Renaissance at the Warburg Institute, University of London. The leading Renaissance scholar of her time, she was a pioneer in recognizing the significance of esoteric traditions in European history. And I did want to make the point that when I'm making these videos, I am not intending to plagiarize people's material. If anything, I'm trying to expose people to this material that might not otherwise be exposed to the material. There may be a lot of people who would rather watch videos on YouTube than go to the library or go to the bookstore and search, track down all these books, and put them all together into a reading collection. So my point in making these videos is not to plagiarize anybody's work, but is to expose people to this information that otherwise wouldn't be exposed to the information. So, Frances Yates, The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, Chapter 15, Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry. The main reason why serious historical studies of the Rosicrucian manifestos and their influence have hitherto been on the whole lacking is no doubt because the whole subject has been bedeviled by enthusiasts for secret societies. There is a vast literature on Rosicrucianism which assumes the existence of a secret society founded by Christian Rosenkreuz and having a continuous existence up to modern times. In the vague and inaccurate world of so-called occultist writings, This assumption has produced a kind of literature which deservedly sinks below the notice of the serious historian. And when, as is often the case, the misty discussion of Rosicrucians and their history becomes involved with the Masonic myths, the inquirer feels he is sinking helplessly into a bottomless bog. Nevertheless, these questions must be faced by anyone who undertakes an inquiry into Rosicrucianism. And though this book has hitherto concentrated on historical elucidation of the background of the Rosicrucian manifestos and on tracing their influence, avoiding the secret society question, the time has come when something must be attempted on the aspect of this subject. Though no very certain results may be arrived at, we shall at least be peering through these myths from the vantage ground of a clearer knowledge of the historical situation in which the Rosicrucian movement arose. The Rosicrucians, do they exist? Are you one? Have you ever seen one? No. How often have we heard this debate with its negative result, as we have made our way through the Rosicrucian literature? The debate still continues. One historian of Freemasonry has divided Rosicrucian theorists into three classes. Those who believe the story of Christian Rosenkreutz and the manner of founding of the RC fraternity, as recounted in the Fama, is true in fact. Those who regard both the society and its founder as purely mythical. Those who, without accepting the historical truth of the story of Rosenkreutz, believe in the existence of the Rosicrucians as a secret society. No serious person can now believe in the literal truth of the Rosenkreutz story, and the view that a real secret society of Rosicrucians existed and was, as it were, veiled in the myth, was questioned by Paul Arnold in his book published in 1955. My researches into the question have not been exhausted. I have not examined every scrap of the printed literature of the Rosicrucian Führer, nor have I made a search for evidence possibly hidden in manuscript documents or archives. I can only say that, so far as my own researches have gone, I have found no evidence of a real secret society calling itself Rosicrucian and really in existence as an organized group at the time the manifestos were published and during the time of the Rosicrucian Führer. There is immense evidence of a passionate search for Rosicrucians, but no evidence that they were ever found. Moreover, the Rosicrucian manifestos were highly publicized statements, thrown provocatively out into the world. Since the prime aim of a secret society must ever to be keep itself secret, it would seem an odd thing for a real Rosicrucian society to do, to publicize itself so dramatically. The manifestos would appear to be proclamations of enlightenment in the form of a utopian myth about a world in which enlightened beings, almost assimilated to spirits, go about doing good, shedding healing influences, disseminating knowledge in the natural sciences and the arts, and bringing mankind back to its paradisal state before the fall. It was thus merely a popular misunderstanding to have assumed that there was a real secret society behind these documents, and the framers of them would seem to have been embarrassed by this misunderstanding. Johann Valentin André made painful efforts to make clear that Christian Rosenkreutz and his fraternity were a fiction. Yet we have seen something real did emerge out of the proclamations of the manifestos. The Rosicrucian brothers were a fiction, but they suggested a reality. The Christian unions, groups of people who tried to form themselves into societies. The right way of looking at the question may thus be to give up the hunt for the real Rosicrucians and to ask instead whether the Rosicrucian movement suggested the formation of secret societies. We have seen that there is this idea of a society for the advancement of learning, such as afterwards materialized in the Royal Society, in the recommendations of the author of the Fama that learned men ought to communicate their discoveries to one another and meet in collaboration. Is there also in the manifestos the idea of, or blueprint for, an international secret society which had and has a real existence, namely Freemasonry? Historical research on the problem of Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry began in Germany in the 18th century, and the main results of German research, particularly expounded in a work by J.G. Buell, published in 1804, were set out in English in an essay by Thomas de Quincey, published in 1824. Though separated from the past by the abyss of 30 years, which destroyed so much evidence, the German researchers of the time of Buell were yet nearer to that past than we are. and it is worthwhile to look at their theories as transmitted by De Quincey as representing an early attempt to solve the problem. The argument of Buell's book is thus resumed by De Quincey. To a hoax played off by a young man of extraordinary talents in the beginning of the 17th century, but for a more elevated purpose than most hoaxes involve, the reader will find the whole mysteries of Freemasonry as now existing all over a civilized world after a lapse of more than 2 centuries are here, i.e. in Buell's book, distinctly traced, such is the power of the grand and capacious aspiration of the philosophic benevolence to embalm even the idlest levities as amber enshrines straws and insects. The young man of extraordinary talents is Johann Valentin André, assumed by Buell to be the author of all of the Rosicrucian manifestos. The hoax is his account of the R.C. fraternity, assumed by Buell to be the origin of Freemasonry. In the last phase, De Quincey is parodying Buell's style. De Quincey, who embellishes and adds to the arguments learned from his German sources, maintains that no college or lodge of Rosicrucian brethren can be shown from historical records to have ever been established in Germany. But he is convinced that when Rosicrucianism was transplanted to England, it became Freemasonry. He solemnly affirms his belief that Freemasonry is neither more or less than Rosicrucianism, as modified by those who transplanted it to England, whence it was re-exported to other countries of Europe. The person chiefly responsible for transplanting Rosicrucianism to England and giving it a new name was, so states De Quincey, Robert Flood. The Masonic beliefs and practices concerned with mystical interpretation of the building of the Temple of Jerusalem can, thinks De Quincey, already be perceived in the Rosicrucian writing, but when Rosicrucianism was transplanted to England, these were attached by Freemasonry to the traditions of the guilds of Masons. He therefore concludes with the utmost confidence that the original Freemasons were a society that arose out of the Rosicrucian mania, certainly within the 13 years from 1633 to 1646, and probably between 1633 and 1640. This theory cannot be entirely right, but the way in which it assumes movement or contact between England and Germany through which something was transplanted from one country to another is interesting in view of what we now know about the currents of thought which moved from England to Germany and vice versa in the early 17th century. The origin of Freemasonry is one of the most debated and debatable subjects in the whole realm of historical inquiry. One has to distinguish between the legendary history of Freemasonry and the problem of when it actually began as an organized institution. According to Masonic legend, Freemasonry is as old as architecture itself, going back to Solomon's building of the temple and to the guilds of medieval Masons who built the cathedrals. At some point, operative Masonry, or the actual craft of building, turned into speculative Masonry, or the moral and mystical interpretation of building, into a secret society with esoteric rites and teachings. When this actually happened, when the Masonic structure and organization came into existence, is not certainly known. Among the very few early known facts is the date at which Elias Ashmole was admitted to a Masonic lodge. Ashmole records in his diary that he was admitted to a Masonic lodge at Warrenton in Lancashire on 16th of October, 1646. The lodge was already in existence. It was not founded by Ashmole. He gives the names of some of the other persons who were admitted to it at the same time, one of them being his cousin, Henry Manwaring, who was a Roundhead. Evidently, since Ashmole was a royalist, members of opposite parties in the Civil Wars could both join in Freemasonry. Ashmole's note of Masonic initiation is said to be the earliest known record of speculative Masonry in an English lodge. It is important that this early Masonic record comes in connection with the man whose knowledge of Rosicrucianism was discussed in the last chapter, where we saw that Ashmole copied out in his own hand the Rosicrucian manifestos, adding to them a formal letter in his own hand admiring their aims and asking to be allowed to join them. This seemed to be a formal exercise, imitating the Rosicrucian tradition in regard to the manifestos, but having no reference to any actually existing group calling themselves Rosicrucians. One now asks oneself the question whether the fact that Ashmole was a Freemason had any bearing on his Rosicrucian exercise. Could it be one possible answer to the problem that quotation and approval of the Rosicrucian manifestos might mean not that one was a Rosicrucian, if these did not exist, but that one did have some other kind of secret affiliation? Though Ashmole's Masonic initiation in October 1646 is usually taken as the earliest on record, there is in fact a well-authenticated earlier one. This is the record of admission into the Masons' Lodge of Edinburgh of Robert Moray on the 20th of May, 1641. Moray did more than probably any other individual to foster the foundation of the Royal Society and to persuade Charles II to establish it by his patronage. He was deeply interested in alchemy and chemistry. Thus, the two persons of whom we have the earliest certain evidence of membership of Masonic lodges were both founding members of the Royal Society, Moray and Ashmole. The Masonic organization was thus clearly in existence at least 20 years before the foundation of the Royal Society in 1660. Earlier than this, factual documentation is hard to come by. There is a hinting reference as early as 1638 to a connection in the public mind between the idea of Rosicrucianism and the idea of Freemasonry. The earliest known reference to the Mason word occurs in a poem published at Edinburgh in 1638. The poem is a metrical account of Perth and the neighborhood, and the reference is as follows. For what we do presage is not in gross, for we be the brethren of the Rosy Cross. We have the Mason word in second sight. Things for to come we can foretell aright. Perhaps the brethren of the Rosy Cross are here in nature the fairies, being who convey the gift of second sight, but that this possibly purely poetic or literary reference to the Rosy Cross brothers should occur in the first printed mention of the Masonic word is interesting. The first printed reference to accepted Masons is found in a Masonic pamphlet of 1676 as follows. To give notice that the modern Green Ribbon Cabal, together with the ancient Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, the Hermetic Adepti, and the Company of Accepted Masons intend to all dine together on the 31st of November next. A comic menu is then described, and those who think of going are advised to wear spectacles, for otherwise 'tis thought the societies will as hitherto make their appearance invisible. This is interesting, for its suggestion of a whole group of esoteric societies, two of them Freemasons and Rosicrucians, evidently different in membership, but having sufficient in common to make it natural for them to dine together. The old joke about invisibility links this reference to the old Rosicrucian tradition. Later again, in fact as late as 1750, the following statement was made in a letter. English Freemasons have copied some ceremonies from Rosicrucians and say they are derived from them and are the same with them. We are now so late that we have almost reached the middle of the 18th century, at about which time, apparently in France, a new grade or set of rituals was initiated within Freemasonry. This was called the Rose Cross grade. Its mystique was apparently definitely Christian, going further into a Christian direction than the deist mystique of other grades. It may have been influenced by mysticism of chivalry. This might seem like an acceptance within Masonic tradition itself, though very late, of the idea of a connection between Rosicrucianism and Masonry. These late indications and traditions, interesting though they are, cannot be relied upon for light of our period, and the period of the early 17th century when the Rosicrucian idea was published through the manifestos. What we are asking is still the old question. Were there any, at the time, Rosicrucians, any real secret organization? The question has perhaps changed a little since we first replied to it in the negative earlier in the chapter. It might now be expanded as, if there were no Rosicrucians, was there perhaps in the background something like an early Masonic or pre-Masonic movement? The legendary history of Freemasonry, of the actual art of building, is recounted in certain medieval poems of about 1400, which are valued in Freemasonry as documents belonging to the old operative masonry, the masonry of the craft or the guild, whence speculative masonry or Freemasonry claims to derive. In these manuscript constitutions of masonry, as these writings are called, masonry or building or architecture as identified with geometry. One account maintains that geometry was discovered before the flood. Another states that Abraham taught the Egyptians geometry. And yet another version of the invention of geometry is drawn from the classical source Diodorus Siculus. Geometry is said to have been invented by the Egyptians in order to cope with the inundations of the Nile. The invention is attributed to Thoth or Hermes, otherwise Hermes Trismegistus, who is also identified with Euclid. Thus the origins of geometry or masonry, and therefore of Freemasonry, recede into a most distant Hebraic or Egyptian past, and are surrounded by mystiques which clearly relate to the Renaissance conception of ancient wisdom. In the Masonic mythology, the true ancient wisdom was enshrined in the geometry of the temple, built by Solomon with the aid of Hiram, king of Tyre. The architect of the temple was believed to be a certain Hiram Habif, not the same person as Hiram the king, whose martyrdom forms the theme of symbolic enactment in Masonic ritual. The official source for Masonic mythology and mystical history would seem to be the Constitution of Freemasons, published by James Anderson in 1725, and which, so I understand, is still treated as an authoritative document for Masonic history by Freemasons themselves. It contains a statement to be read at the admission of a new brother, which opens as follows. Adam, our first parent, created after the image of God, the great architect of the universe, must have had the liberal sciences, particularly geometry, written on his heart, for ever since the fall, we find the principles of it in the heart of his offering. The history of geometry is then traced through biblical history, culminating in the building of the temple by Solomon. As in most histories of Freemasonry, the constitutions, after the account of builders, and building in the Bible, goes on to give a history of non-biblical architecture. First, the royal art of architecture spread from the Hebrews to the Greeks. Then Rome learned the art and became the center of learning and imperial power, having its zenith under Augustus Caesar, in whose reign was born God's Messiah, the great architect of the church. Augustus encouraged the great Vitruvius, the father of all architects to this day. Augustus was the Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge at Rome and the founder of the Augustan style. The story then runs rapidly through the loss of Roman masonry in the barbarian invasions and the rise of the Gothic style, and mentions that in ignorant times geometry might be condemned for conjuration. Coming to modern or more recent times, the account states that Queen Elizabeth was not favorable to architecture, but that King James revived the English lodges and recovered the Roman architecture from the Gothic ignorance. In Italy, brilliant architects had been reviving the classical style, which was above all restored by the great Palladio, who is rivaled in England by our great master mason, Inigo Jones. Charles I also patronized Mr. Jones, who is presented as undoubtedly a Freemason, as was Charles II. Sir Christopher Wren, architect of St. Paul's, is mentioned without approbation. This history does not make clear the point about which definite information is so much needed. Why did modern Freemasonry begin as an organized secret society? Most books on Freemasonry confuse architecture in the Bible, legendary stories, the history of architecture in general, and the history of Freemasonry after the manner of James Anderson in the Constitutions of 1725. But it seems probable, and this point is usually made by Masonic historians, that the speculative kind of Masonry and its gradual disassociation from operative Masonry began with the interest in the revived Vitruvius and the revived classical architecture. Though Anderson is not definite about this, it would seem that Inigo Jones is very important in this history, perhaps suggesting that it was in association with the introduction and spread of the Augustan style by Inigo Jones that Freemasonry as an institution, distinct from Masonic legend, began in England. One notices a curious gap in Masonic history. Why is it that no mention is made of John Dee, the famous Hermetic philosopher, author of a famous preface to an English translation of Euclid, in which he praised the great Vitruvius and urged the revival of Euclid, architecture, and all mathematical arts? The English Euclid, with Dee's preface to it, was published in 1570, surely a most memorable monument to the sacred art of geometry, and heralding the revival of classic architecture in England long before Inigo Jones. It is difficult to believe that the Freemasons did not know Dee's preface to the Euclid, with its many quotations from Vitruvius. And indeed, it seems pretty clear that James Anderson did know of it, for at more than one point he seems to be almost quoting from it. Compare, for example, Anderson's words on the reign of Augustus as the time when God's Messiah, the great architect of the church, was born, with Dee's words on Augustus, in whose days our heavenly archimaster was born. Dee, one feels, must have been deliberately left out of the official Masonic history. What could have been the reason for this omission? Perhaps the same reason as the one which so often caused his name to be avoided, his reputation for conjuring, and Merrick Casaubon's damning publication. Though ironically enough, Dee himself in the preface deplores the accusation of conjuring brought against him by the ignorant, just as Anderson in the Constitutions mentions that in ignorant times geometry might be condemned for conjuration. There is thus a problem here. How does this problem connect with our problem about Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry? I have no very clear answer to give to these questions. As I said at the beginning of this chapter, this book is not primarily oriented towards the secret society problem. All that I could do is try and suggest how the historical movements described in this book may present new historical paths along which future investigators might move in the hope of finding new evidence. Let us suppose, purely as a hypothesis, a historical line along which future investigations might move, that it was in Elizabethan England that an idea of something like what was later the Masonic idea had developed, in association with cults of the Queen and of the Dee movement, in which Philip Sidney was associated. In Elizabethan England, bound together by a revived chivalry and by Renaissance esoteric movements, and spiritually organized to resist a dangerous enemy, it seemed likely that there would have been secret groupings. When these movements moved abroad in the wake of the Elector Palatine and his Stuart bride, may they not have included not only English chivalrous ideas and English alchemical ideas, but also the idea of a kind of pre-Masonry, for which John Dee may have been partly responsible, just as he was responsible for so much else in these movements. One should look for possibly Masonic mystiques among the writings of the Rosicrucian groups, particularly Mayer and André, though at this date it would be difficult to differentiate these from the general Renaissance mystiques. The problem is complicated by the fact that although it seems more than likely that secret societies were developing under the pressures of the times, one does not know how many of these societies there were, nor how, if at all, they were related to one another. As has been said earlier, all the secret movements of the late 16th century might have had a secret sympathy with the movements around the Elector Palatine. We know that the Family of Love was a secret society which undoubtedly had a real existence and organization, arising out of the situation in the Netherlands in the late 16th century. We know that many well-known people were secretly members of this sect or society, which allowed its members to belong ostensibly to any religious denomination while secretly maintaining their affiliation with the family. These attitudes of the Family of Love have something in common with those of Freemasonry. We know that secret membership of the family was widespread among printers, that, for example, the great Antwerp printer Plantin was a member of this sect and keen on propagating it through publishing works of those in sympathy with it. It has been suggested earlier that the DeBry family of printers, who had connections with the Plantin firm, might have been family, and that the movement of this firm into Palatinian territory, where it was published at Oppenheim, works of persons in the Rosicrucian interest, Flood and Mayer, might have been because of secret sympathies with the movements in the Palatine. Again, we have thought that influences from Giordano Bruno could be detected in the Rosicrucian movement. Bruno, the intensely Hermetic philosopher who propagated through Europe in the late 16th century an esoteric movement which demanded a general reformation of the world, in the form of a return to Egyptian religion and good magic, may have formed a secret society. The Giordanisti among Lutheran circles in Germany. Bruno had visited England, where he had probably been in contact with Sidney and had shown himself sympathetic to the more esoteric aspects of the Elizabethan chivalric cult. Here again is a possible influence on Rosicrucianism mingling with other influences. One might say that the family influences might have represented a secret stream originating in the Netherlands, that a Bruno movement might appeal to a secret movement in Italy, and that all such influences might have coexisted with an English esoteric movement strongly influenced by Dr. John Dee, which was building up the great dash for European liberation through placing Frederick of the Palatine on the Bohemian throne. All this is obviously a groping in the dark, suggestions made up of ifs and perhaps, yet it is necessary to describe such groupings in order to indicate the difficulty of the theme of this chapter. We know that the later 16th century and the early 17th century was an age of secret societies, but we do not know their relationships to one another or how they may have differed from one another. The English document of 1676 describes how the Green Ribbon Cabal dined with the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, the Hermetic Adepti, and accepted Masons, all having in common their invisibility. Perhaps this fragment represents earlier traditions of, so to speak, intercommunion between secret societies, though in the earlier and more terrible times such relationships would have been deadly serious and full of danger. If within this complex secret situation around the German Rosicrucian movement there was an English esoteric influence, perhaps stemming from a Masonic movement associated with Dee, perhaps combined with English chivalric influences to give the name Rose Cross, there may have been something real behind these mysterious manifestos, something in the nature of a pre-Masonic movement. Let me emphasize again that these groupings are intended only as a hypothesis, which might guide future investigators along a historical path which has not yet been trodden by those interested in early Masonic history, for no one, I believe, has known of the English influences on the German Rosicrucian movement. If such influences went out from England to Germany in the early 17th century, arriving also via Dee's mission to Bohemia, when would such influences have returned to England? Surely after the crash of 1620. Surely an intense movement of loyalty and sympathy with the King and Queen of Bohemia would have been generated through the terrible events through which they were forced into that long exile at The Hague. And here it is that the new historical approach may help through indicating what may be quite a new field of inquiry. There were Rosicrucian movements at The Hague beginning as early as 1622, and concerning which a certain amount of material is known, and more might be found. It seems possible that organized Freemasonry might have been found at The Hague, an encouraging soil in which to grow, perhaps out of or in conjunction with Rosicrucianism. In that atmosphere of loyalty to a lost cause, the central figure in which, after the ex-king of Bohemia's death, was the ex-queen of Bohemia, the royal widow who kept her court for so long at The Hague. The members of the House of Stuart tended to be carriers of Freemasonry. One has only to think of the Jacobite Freemasonry which surrounded the pretenders. Perhaps there is one member of the House of Stuart whose milieu has not been sufficiently investigated from this point of view. Elizabeth Stuart, ex-Queen of Bohemia. She had a powerful character and she exerted great influence, possibly in the direction of keeping alive a kind of royalism which even parliamentarians could accept, which could even have something in common with an exiled Bohemian like Comenius, which might have facilitated the ease with which the restoration of Charles II was effected. That easy transition from resolution back to royalism has always been a matter for surprise, and Freemasonry has been suspected in connection with it. Our historical research thus suggests there was something in J.G. Buell's theory, though not in the form in which he propounded it. The European phenomenon of Freemasonry almost certainly was connected with the Rosicrucian movement. Nevertheless, even this provisional and hazy statement is far from solving the problem, for it is clear that the two movements, though probably related, were not identical. Freemasonry combines an esoteric approach to religion with ethical teachings and emphasis on philanthropy, and in ways that it follows the pattern of the Rosicrucian brothers. But as Arthur Edward Waite pointed out, it differs from that pattern in not being interested in the reform of the arts and science, in scientific research, or in alchemy and magic, and in many other ways. From the great reservoir of spiritual and intellectual power, of moral and reforming vision, represented by the Rosicrucian manifestos, Freemasonry drew off one stream. Other streams flowed into the Royal Society, into the alchemical movement, and in many other directions. Our concern in this book is with the Rosicrucian Enlightenment as a whole, and its manifold and multitude manifestations, and less with the canalization and some aspects of it into secret societies. The pursuit of secret societies has tended to obscure the importance of the theme. We can never know, for example, whether Francis Bacon was some kind of early Freemason, nor is it necessary or indeed important that we should know such a thing. Much more important is to trace the influence of the ideas of Rosicrucianism than invent the membership of a secret society. Yet the theme studied in the present chapter, the theme of secrecy, is of importance, for it connects the Renaissance with the early scientific revolution. The great mathematical and scientific thinkers of the 17th century have at the back of their minds the Renaissance traditions of esoteric thinking, of mystical continuity from Hebraic or Egyptian wisdom, of that conflation of Moses with Hermes Trismegistus which fascinated the Renaissance. These traditions survived across the period in secret societies, particularly in Freemasonry. Hence, it is that we do not know the full content of the minds of the early members of the Royal Society unless we take into account the esoteric influences from the Renaissance surviving in their background. Below or beyond their normal religious affiliations, they would see the great architect of the universe as an all-embracing religious conception which included and encouraged the scientific urge to explore the architect's work. And this unspoken or secret esoteric background was a heritage from the Renaissance, from those traditions of Magia and Kabbalah, of Hermetic and Hebraic mysticism which underlay Renaissance Neoplatonism as fostered in the Italian Renaissance. The Fama can thus now be seen as the perfect manifesto, combining as it does the proclamation of advancement of learning in a new enlightened age with its subtle suggestion of invisibility as the hallmark of the Rosicrucian brothers. So that was Dame Frances Yates in her book, The Rosicrucian Enlightenment. And so I think it's very curious when you get into the history, very fascinating when you get into the history of some of the connections between Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, that there are all these different points of view. The Masonic point of view on one hand and the Rosicrucian point of view on the other hand have many similarities and also have many differences. And from a Gnostic point of view, a third point of view, you can see that there are many things it has in common with the Rosicrucian perspective, and you can see that there are many things that philosophy has in common with the Masonic perspective. And then so to throw a fourth perspective in there, to throw the perspective of Frances Yates, gives a bigger picture, helps paint a bigger picture, and I think that the truth ultimately lies somewhere in the middle. So I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to watch my video. If you want to like, share, and subscribe, that'd be great. I've got lots of great content coming up. I'll have some more videos on this series about Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism and some of the connections between the two. Thanks for watching. Peace Profound and LVX.